late in the afternoon, day 2. Thank you all for coming today. This session is entitled Framing Male Engagement for Enhancing Programs. My name is Dominic Shattuck. I'm Director of Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning for the Breakthrough Action Project and co-chair of the Male Engagement Task Force, USAID-sponsored Male Engagement Task Force. Our presenters, Emily Zimmerman, Rebecca Lundgren, and Danette Wilkins, will describe the application of male-focused interventions and the frameworks through which to conceptualize and implement the model, the programming. In my opinion, this is the most innovative space at this conference and in reproductive health. The work of the individuals on the panel reflect that innovation, and complementing their work are others who are developing new reversible male contraceptive methods. A thoughtful combination of these two spaces are required to meaningfully move the needle to include men in reproductive health programming. There are legitimate challenges to integrating men into reproductive health services. Some of them are social and others are political. The roles either assigned to or assumed by men in reproductive health elevate the stakes of this work. Further complicating this dynamic is the added need to challenge the zero-sum mentality that pits men's reproductive health against women's. As a result, there's no room for error in the innovation or the implementation of this work, and there shouldn't be. So the activities presented in this session were developed to provide guidance to others in hopes to bring men into the fold. Before I pass it over to the presenters, I am going to make a little bit of a plea. Maybe somebody will see this recording if they're one of those youth. This conference has done a great job of engaging and mobilizing youth throughout the years, and it's all I always hope, and I actually have had some conversations with others about how to engage youth around male engagement, around men, including men in reproductive health programming at the next ICFP, and maybe a couple of those people will, maybe take some of this home with them and integrate it into their work as advocates. So I'll pass it over to our first presenter, Danette, take it away, Danette.
Thank you so much, Dominic. Greetings. So my name is Danette, and I'm a family planning officer with Breakthrough Action. Breakthrough Action is USAID's flagship social and behavior change project that works in partnership with governments, civil society, and communities around the world to implement creative and sustainable social and behavior change programming. I'm honored to be here today to share a tool developed under Breakthrough Action to strengthen the engagement of men and boys in family planning programming. No Care Do, a theory of change for engaging men and boys in family planning. Conceptually, we continue to make progress in rethinking how men and boys interact with family planning and sexual and reproductive health. Many of you may already be familiar with the figure on the screen. This figure visualizes the ideal in terms of men and boys engagement, and the ideal entails men and boys embodying all three roles, with each mutually reinforcing one another. There are many interpretations of what it means to engage men and boys, which makes it necessary to define and refine our understanding. The following is an emerging definition that recognizes and builds on these three roles of partners, clients and users, and agents of change. So the definition says, an intentional process that supports men and boys to participate fully and meaningfully in family planning and sexual and reproductive health, both individually and with their partners, families, and communities in supportive, affirming, and gender equitable ways. This definition speaks to the transformative potential of this work when done with curiosity, humility, and intention. Ideally, engaged men and boys actively resist harmful and inequitable gender norms, roles, and dynamics, and enthusiastically model equitable gender norms, roles, and dynamics. This process is not only intentional, it is also ongoing. For this reason, it is important that we meet men and boys where they are, and as the definition states, accompany them to participate in supportive, affirming, and gender equitable ways. This tool is the result of a participatory development process with global program implementers and researchers with expertise in men and masculinities, family planning and sexual and reproductive health, and social and behavior change. The primary audience for this tool is program implementers working to increase and strengthen men's and boys' engagement across the life course and across all levels of the socio-ecological model. That said, this tool is also relevant for other audiences like researchers, government officials, and funders. And this tool is currently available in French, English, and Spanish. So, what do we already know? We already know that engaging men and boys is key to achieving the ability of all people to freely choose if, whether, and when to have children. It is also key to achieving reproductive empowerment for all. We also already know that engaging men and boys, where appropriate, can improve health outcomes for men, women, and other gender diverse people, transform harmful and inequitable gender norms, and advance gender equality. Despite growing evidence, most programming fails to engage them fully and meaningfully. And this failure to do so reflects both internalization and institutionalization of restrictive gender norms that uphold reproduction and reproductive labor as issues that primarily concern women and girls. It also reflects the challenges, both real and perceived, of engaging men and boys without threatening the bodily autonomy and agency of women and girls. Though progress has been made to engage men and boys, this work continues to be incomplete. For one, this work has tended to focus at the individual and interpersonal levels. And I'm going to go back to that previous slide really quickly. So it's focused on knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors, which provides limited contextualization of men's and boys' engagement. Additionally, this work has tended to focus on engaging men and boys as partners of women and girls, and to a lesser degree as agents of change for gender equality, without also engaging them as clients and users of services and products themselves. Program implementers working to engage men and boys often have limited guidance on how best to do this work, and this tool helps to fill that gap. And other tools, of course, are still needed. In this tool, we introduce a conceptual model that visualizes what is needed for men and boys to be engaged. This figure on your screen shows the dynamic between the core components of know, care, do. The know component refers to having factual, practical knowledge about family planning and sexual and reproductive health information, services, and products. The care component refers to assuming responsibility and accountability for individual health and reproduction, as well as accountability for partners' reproductive priorities, needs, and preferences. And the do component refers to taking concrete actions to communicate and help achieve reproductive intentions and goals, both individually and with partners. I cannot emphasize enough that these components are interrelated and interdependent, interacting with one another in myriad ways. Here are a few high-level examples, or actually I'll just give one high-level example. Men's and boys' knowledge can influence whether they view family planning as relevant to them, and also influence their self-efficacy according to their own priorities, needs, and preferences, or those of their partners. For the sake of time, I won't give other examples, but I really want to encourage you all to consider specific examples from your own work of how these three components interact. Programming should be specifically designed to address and shift the know, care, do components and explicitly focus on how best to do so in ways that are specific to the context and also culturally relevant. So, engaging men and boys remains an ongoing challenge and opportunity, not only due to different interpretations of what it means to engage men and boys, but also due to different understandings of the limits and potential of engaging them for improving health outcomes and advancing gender equality. As already mentioned, there's limited guidance on how to do this work. But this theory of change aims to support program implementers by defining the core components of know, care, do, establishing key principles for engaging men and boys in family planning, and detailing how to strengthen their engagement. Having already covered the know, care, do components, I'm going to go ahead and turn to the key principles that inform this theory of change. So on your screen are the 5 key principles that emerge from the conceptual model of know, care, do. I won't go into too much detail about these, but I would like to emphasize one in particular, because I think it's one that often gets lost in this work that we do. It's really important to position the engagement in the broader context of men's and boys' lives. The relevance of family planning in the everyday lives of men and boys depends on their current life stage, their previous life experiences, and their future life plans. It is critical that programming acknowledges that their priorities, needs, and preferences change as they age. Programming that applies a life course perspective recognizes and responds to the implications of family planning choices and decisions by addressing men's and boys' current life stage while also considering their past and preparing them for the future. So here it is. This is the theory of change. As shown on the screen, the theory of change broadly describes the key drivers of men's and boys' engagement, critical intervention features to address these drivers, anticipated changes resulting from these interventions, and how these changes then shape and influence men's and boys' engagement across those core components of no care do in order to advance reproductive empowerment for all. In this theory of change, the key drivers are detailed across all levels of the socio-ecological model in response to the pervasive internalization and institutionalization of restrictive gender norms that uphold reproduction and reproductive labor as concerns of women and girls primarily. Intervention features or approaches and strategies that can be applied to address these key drivers include shifting norms and changing attitudes and beliefs, mainstreaming gender transformative approaches, engaging individuals and communities in social and structural change, and more. And moving on, some of the anticipated changes that can result from the previously mentioned intervention features include an improved enabling environment for engaging men and boys, change social expectations that encourage their equitable participation in family planning, change relationship expectations and behaviors regarding their roles in family planning, as well as change individual preferences, attitudes, and beliefs. I would also like to call your attention to the arrow labeled structural factors. This theory of change accounts for structural factors such as governance, economic conditions, political stability, because most current programming has not sufficiently targeted or addressed these factors to date. This is a very important growth area for future programming and research, to better understand how structural factors shape and influence knowledge, attitudes, perceptions, and behaviors among men and boys, and what can be done to shift them in partnership with governments, civil society, and communities. By upholding increased reproductive empowerment for all as the overarching goal, this theory of change encourages program implementers to focus on underlying root causes of low levels and low quality of men's and boys' engagement, including gender inequality. So, how can this theory of change be used? Well, with regard to programming, the theory of change can be used throughout the program cycle to strengthen engagement. For example, for country regional strategic planning, it can be used to guide priority setting and agenda setting. For project design and implementation, it can be used to guide formative research and program goals and objectives. For monitoring, it can be used to guide development of monitoring and evaluation plans, including indicators. And to not leave out family planning services, this theory of change can also be applied to that area in order to plan, prepare, and maintain health services that are welcoming and inclusive of men and boys, as well as their experiences across the life course. So here are some key considerations for implementation. I won't read all of these, but I do want to focus on a couple. It's absolutely critical that you collect data, you review available data, you conduct additional research to really understand the specific context in which you're working and how men and boys are impacted by different drivers. Because that information is then going to allow you to figure out who you need to work with in order to address the drivers and what intervention features are going to be most appropriate to address those same drivers. It's also really critical to conduct awareness-raising activities. As Dominic mentioned in the introduction, this is often seen as a zero-sum game. So there are a lot of naysayers and skeptics that need to be sensitized to the importance of engaging men and boys. And this brings us now to preparing for implementation challenges. So I already mentioned the need to engage and respond to naysayers and skeptics, and really emphasize that this is not a zero-sum game. It's also important to monitor for unintended consequences regarding gender and power dynamics and be prepared to address them. Often, folks who are skeptical of male engagement programming point to some of these unintended harmful consequences that can occur when this work is not done intentionally and thoughtfully. And by building your monitoring and evaluation systems to track progress, you'll be able to anticipate and respond to these unintended consequences if they arise. Remember, this work is about social cultural shift, and it can take a long time. So we really need to document what we do and do not do to understand what is possible with available time and resources. Most men and boys live in places where their participation in even their own sexual and reproductive lives is either discouraged or not actively encouraged. This holds for high income as well as low and middle income countries. So this theory of change is really useful for helping program implementers to understand in general terms what they can do to help strengthen men's and boys' engagement in family planning, while also reinforcing the bodily autonomy and agency of women, girls, and other gender diverse people. As a next step, I invite you all to review this tool in detail and consider how you can apply it to your own work around the world. I have some copies of the Theory of Change document with me here, and also a QR code for those who are wanting to review this document more in detail and share it with others. I'd like to acknowledge many of the folks who contributed to this process, including the two leads, Jeffrey Edmeades and Margaret Green, as well as many others around the world. And I'd just like to thank you once more for your time today and your interest in this topic, and I look forward to discussing more later. Thank you.
Thank you, Danette. So, and thank you so much, Danette. Next speaker will be Rebecca Lundgren, and we're lucky we have a smaller number of speakers today, so they have a few extra minutes, and we'll also have a little bit extra time at the end. I know I didn't explain this before for Q&A. So, Rebecca, if you take it away.
Thanks, Dominic. I'm really happy to be here, and you're going to hear some similarities between these two presentations, in part because some of the same people were involved. So you saw the thank you to Jeff and Margaret. Tim Shand was involved in our work. So there's a lot of people that this work is building on. About, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, we, at the Passages Project, started to think about life course theory and how it applies to men's lives. And then a few years after that, we were asked by USAID, our donor at that point, to help us move that into a tool. So what I'll be sharing today as a tool is for integrating a life course approach into programming with men and boys. But I'm presenting on behalf of my colleague, Courtney McLarnon, who couldn't be here today, and also Natasha Stefanovic-Finn, who helped to develop this tool. So I'm also going to ask you to take a little bit of a step back, because what this approach really is kind of a paradigm shift, to use an overused word. I've been sitting through a lot of presentations here about male engagement and even about engaging women and working with women. And there seems to be a little bit of I think we could do a better job if we apply a little bit more of a thinking about life course theory and some of the topics that I'm going to discuss today, and that Danette also approached. So the purpose of the tool is to apply a life course theory. And this life course recognizes that men and boys have agency, and they have the capability to make choices, but those choices are embedded in the social structure in which they live. Opportunities and constraints. I've been hearing a lot of criticisms about male engagement at this conference already, and I think part of that has to do with kind of a lack of situating men and boys, within the systems that they work. So the project, this work was produced under the USAID-funded Passages Project, which sought to improve family planning among youth through research and interventions addressing social norms. And our idea was to focus on moments of transition, so of course, in the life course. So that made this topic very kind of germane to our overall work. So you might ask, what value might life course theory have and its principles have for male engagement programming? Most programs already do segment the men they work with by socio-demographic characteristics. You'll have gone to presentations about newly married couples, first-time parents, early adolescents. So we are already segmenting young men. But life course theory goes beyond that. It encouraged us to remember that the specific characteristics, yes, segmentation that I just mentioned, but also to apply a more holistic, maybe a dynamic perspective, such as life transitions, the effect of events early in life, later on in life, and the influence of other people on men. And of course, the same could be said about women. So male engagement programs are, I said sometimes, but I'd say always, shaped by assumptions and bias. We all bring assumptions to the table when we design and implement programs. And sometimes we fail to apply a holistic understanding of men and boys' lived experiences, their motivations, and their needs. It's easy for us to view men and boys as a homogeneous group rather than consider how their needs evolve over time and are shaped by the individual and environmental factors. So our idea is that programs could be more effective if we apply understanding of why men behave why men behave the way they do, how their behavior changes over time, and how settings influence their behavior. So life course theory, which Danette mentioned, is multidisciplinary. It's rooted in anthropology, sociology, economics, and psychology. And I've used life course as a series of age-related patterns of behavior that are embedded in social institutions, personal experience, and social history in ways that give social and personal meaning to the passages of time. So it's a record of age-related transitions that are socially created, socially recognized, and shared. So we're going to talk a lot about those social meanings. And I want to start by illustrating the relevance of this perspective by sharing an excerpt from a life history we collected many years ago in Uganda. He says, I started by talking to her, sometimes when she was on her way to the well. I insisted until we had sex. You feel like you've grown up and you're proud of yourself. Also, you feel like people are grading you and you've passed some sort of test. A boy like me prays and hopes that I'll get something for my future and we can stay together as a husband and wife. He goes on to say that when he becomes a father, my maturity will be there. I will be able to sit among the clan. If you have no children, people minimize you, and there is no one who will come to your house. So you can see from his story or his experiences how his individual behavior is embedded in the social context. The tool that we're going to see labels the principle of time and space, how boys and men pass through life stages that are defined mainly by social meaning. This slide shows the 5 principles of a life course perspective: lifespan, agency, time and place, timing, and linked lives. These have powerful effects on individuals' lives, particularly on relationships, health, education, violence, etc. Many programs do work with particular age groups, but not all employ life course considerations. So lifespan, with that you're considering people change biologically, socially, and emotionally throughout their lives, adapting to changes in their environment, and they continue to learn from others. So that's one key point. Then you think about agency. People's life courses are formed through their choices and their actions, which are shaped by social institutions like their family and their economic system, as well as political and social changes. But their choices are limited by their awareness of the options they have. So some men or boys may not be aware of options to behave in different ways. So that's part of agency. So an example is that in places where fundamental aspects of life, like childbearing, are limited, so is their agency in shaping their life course. Time and place. So we know that actions and agency are dependent upon the environment and social structures. The geographic, cultural, and social features shape life course. For an example, an urban context may offer many opportunities for youth to be fully employed, while countries with strict legal restrictions on child labor may suggest a different reality for some men. And very importantly is timing. The consequences and meaning of an event depends on when it takes place in the life course. For example, becoming pregnant as an unmarried adolescent as opposed to a new bride has a very different social meaning. And also another key point of life course is thinking about how an event or your early life affects you later. So a really good example is how we know from the evidence that witnessing violence in the household or experiencing violence is the strongest predictor for being experiencing or perpetrating violence later. But many violence projects work with older adolescents or adults rather than targeting young boys and girls when they're younger. So linked lives, I think we're all quite aware of how the events of other people in our lives can influence us. So I'm going to go on with another story. So this is also from Uganda. He began dating and was concerned about his education and struggles between his family and his neighbors. As his body changed, he began to receive more respect, but he was also afraid of getting into trouble. His beliefs about gender became more and more unequal and entrenched, and he supported gender work responsibilities and hitting one's wife as a way of discipline. So here you see the importance of linked lives and how the family, neighbors, and peer influenced Simon. We also see the concept of the lifespan and how changes that he's going through in puberty are going to affect him, throughout his life. I'll share one more example. Okello, he said, as a man, if your elderly people have started saying anything, you can even call those elders, tell them that you are still planning for your family, and no one should be scared that you're not going to produce. You can tell them that you're planning for the future. So here you see examples of a number of life course principles. He's expressing agency in the way that he's responding to the elders in his community. It's talking about timing, what is a socially correct moment of an event, and then time and place. Kinship structure in northern Uganda in the aftermath of a 25-year-old civil war added a particular importance and meaning towards pregnancy. So let's talk about the tool for a moment. So gender transformative programming should work with boys and men throughout their lives using different approaches developed depending on what stage they're in. And we believe that programs that apply these principles more thoroughly have greater impact for in the long term and for achieving gender equity. The reflection and action tool can be used to identify strategic points in the program design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation process to improve program outcomes. The tool applies throughout two elements. One are life course principles that we were just talking about, and the other is the program cycle, which Danette was talking about. So the tool is divided into sections by program cycle with the key life course principles woven throughout. In each question, the tool offers questions and actions to consider. So the questions are linked to suggested actions and meant to help programmers and implementers reflect on how you can incorporate these principles in a concrete way into your programs. And the actions include steps or activities to integrate life course into each program phase. Each section also includes case studies and additional resources on that particular topic. So you might be wondering what this means in concrete terms. Here are a few ways the tool can be used. You can use this tool to develop your log frame or theory of change. You can use it to adapt activities that you already have to include life course considerations. And you can also use it to collect and use monitoring data to assess how well your program is reaching boys and men with strategies meant to improve gender equity. And in this slide, I want to talk about some of the examples of what can happen if you don't apply these principles. So, for example, sometimes you see programs that are working with boys or men too early or too late. So, for example, missing the opportunity to shape gender attitudes before they're firmly entrenched in later adolescence. Sometimes we assume that all boys at a certain age or grade have the same needs. Think about primary school, for example. You might think that all boys in third grade are the same, but some might be 12 years old, 13 or 14-year-olds. They're already sexually active. They're ready for the kind of information that the other boys at that age may not be, who are not yet sexually active. So again, for failing to understand the heterogeneity of the groups that we work with. This one I see a lot. We don't recognize men's agency or their lack of it. I see people, even in the USA New Gender Strategy, there's a little bit of some discussion about how men are kind of powerless to challenge the dominant norms in their society, and you just kind of have to give them a pass because it's so hard for them and the norms are so difficult. So that's really taking away men's agency. They do have agency to learn and change. Or sometimes we fail to take into account the important influences on men. I was in a presentation this morning about they were talking about family planning, use, and violence, but it was a social network analysis. The biggest influence on men were their mothers-in-laws, and they were also, violence and family planning use were predicted by the social norms of the mother-in-law, not the wife or the man. So that gives you an example of how other people have a lot of influence on men, and we need to take those people into account as well, not just focusing on men alone. And then finally, this is another one I know that I've done, is failed to respond to men's dynamic needs. So their need shifts. When they're young, maybe they need condoms for protection. When they're older, maybe it's for family planning. Then they maybe have infertility questions. So needs are shifting quite quickly throughout the life course. And it may even shift, with different partners, different wives in polygynous societies. So I hope you're asking, where can I find the reflection and action tool? You can find this tool and also the longer, more theoretical document on the Passages website. You can see the title there. We went through a series of kind of workshops to validate the tool. We piloted it with 2 organizations and then revised it and published it in just this year, I guess it was. And you can find it on the Passages Legacy website. So if you go to irh.org, you can find this tool and a number of other interesting materials on men and engaging men that you might find of interest. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Our last speaker for this session is Emily Zimmerman, who'll talk a little bit more about program implementation that is related to these different frameworks.
Hi, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here and share some case studies, case examples from practice, focusing in on one specific aspect of male engagement, which is establishing an enabling environment for men and boys in health clinics. And I'll be sharing some examples from some work in Uganda and Zambia. I wanted to start us off by looking back at this visual that you saw in Danette's presentation about the different ways that male engagement can support reproductive health aims and what male engagement might mean, and just reflect a little bit on how an enabling environment in health clinics can support these 3 aims. I think it's fairly intuitive to think about how an enabling environment can support men as clients of SRH services, but we can also think about how the information and counseling that they receive in a clinic, and how the explicit invitation and signal that bringing men into this environment and welcoming them to receive services and information themselves, how that can really signal the role that they might play in their communities, in their families, and with their partners. So we can really think about an enabling environment as supportive of all 3 of these aims. As I mentioned, I'll be sharing some examples from 2 different projects. The first is some work in Uganda. This was work that Ideas 42 conducted in collaboration with IntraHealth, and it was ultimately focused on encouraging postpartum family planning uptake through positive male engagement in the process. You may have seen my colleague Susan Tino from IntraHealth present on some other aspects of this work. If you haven't seen that presentation, please find her and talk to her about the interactive game in communities. But I'll be focused in a little bit on some other aspects of the program. I'll also be sharing some examples from work that Breakthrough Action conducted in Zambia. And this was design work focused on encouraging men to access health services more broadly, including SRH services. Both of these examples were work that used a behavioral design approach to unpack and understand the contextual and psychological drivers of men's choices and what might get in the way of their meaningful access and engagement with services and clinics, and then design targeted solutions to address those behavioral drivers. This slide shows 4 common challenges that we saw across the 2 contexts. And I'll point out here that these are not in any way intended to be comprehensive. We know that there are lots of other challenges that may get in the way, but these were 4 challenges that came through very strongly in the work in Uganda and Zambia. So the first one is that we heard from men that very often they care really deeply about their family's health and well-being. And they often see themselves as playing a role in promoting their family's broader health and well-being. But they don't necessarily always connect accessing services themselves to that role that they're playing in their family. We also heard from men that they have a lot of misgivings and concerns about how they might be treated in a clinic if they walk in the door, and especially if they ask about SRH services. We heard concerns about privacy and confidentiality that we might more commonly associate with concerns that women have about accessing services, but that was something that we heard very strongly from men as well. And finally, we saw that health providers, when they do interact with a man or a boy in a health facility, perhaps for another health visit or health need, they aren't always initiating conversations about family planning and SRH services. And sometimes this is just because they don't remember or don't think to offer. Sometimes it's because they assume that the man may not be interested or may even react negatively. But we also hear from men that they are interested. They do want to be offered information, and they want to have the option to ask questions and receive information from health workers. But because they're not sure how a health worker might respond, they're not bringing up the topic either. So this creates some missed opportunities for those conversations to occur at other moments when men might be accessing other health services. So all 4 of these challenges imply specific design aims for what we would hope a solution might be able to achieve to improve the environment for men and boys and more meaningfully engage them in counseling, in services, and in conversations about FP. So the first one that you see here is an aim to illustrate the value that service access for men and boys might have for the goals that they have for themselves and their broader family's well-being. The second design aim that we can think about is to convey an explicit invitation for men and boys to visit clinics. We can also think about communicating assurances of privacy and confidentiality and expressing and reminding providers to very consistently offer FP counseling and services and information to all relevant clients, including men and boys. I will walk through some quick examples of all 4 of these design aims, drawing from the work in Uganda and Zambia. So the first one that you see here is dedicated service offerings. This is an example from the work in Zambia of monthly health and wellness days organized at health clinics for men to receive services and information that are tailored to the needs and priorities that they've expressed. We heard from men that they're often very concerned about wait times at health facilities and hesitate to go to a facility because they don't know how long they might need to wait to see a provider. So one feature of these wellness days was allowing men to sign up in advance for appointment slots so they could be assured of being seen relatively quickly when they came in. Men were also allowed to just show up on the day of and wait for services and see a provider in that way as well. When they did see a provider, the provider used a special toolkit for providing counseling on these key health areas, providing some information and also framing health services and health service access in terms of broader family well-being and in terms of the role and responsibility that a man may see for himself within his family. The men received a take-home packet, which included an advice sheet, which you see on this slide, and were also offered condoms to take home with them. This is a photo from one of the wellness days. And I'll mention here that these were wellness days that targeted adult men in the community, but the project also designed a kind of separate set of adolescent wellness days on a different day of the month in the health facilities. And that was a time when adolescents, both boys and girls, could come to the clinic and be kind of assured of being able to see a provider in a more discreet way at a time when they were unlikely to see adult members of the community while they were accessing those services. And they could come either together as couples or individually. And again, that was for adolescent boys and girls at the same time. Moving on to the second design aim of conveying an explicit invitation. This is an example from the work in Uganda of a planning card given out in communities to men that prompts them to have a conversation with their partner about contraception and child spacing, and to visit a clinic together with their partner to learn more, to receive counseling, and to make a decision together about whether and which contraceptive method to use. And what this does is very explicitly invite men along with their partners to visit a health facility at a time when they might not feel that the health provider would welcome them necessarily, or that they would be expected to be there, but to kind of bring them into the conversation as someone else who can come along with their partner to learn together. This is a photo of the work in Uganda. As I mentioned, this is part of a broader set of interventions. So this planning card was given out to men after they played an interactive game in the community. And it was the sort of requested next step for men to take after they'd learned about FP, explored some conversations, and thought about its applicability to them, to take the card back to their wives, have these conversations, and then consider going into a clinic. We did hear from the village health team members who facilitated these games that they saw this planning card as something that could be very useful outside of the context of the game as well. So, for example, in a one-on-one conversation with a man, they also saw value in giving him this card and using it as an encouragement to have the conversation and then come into a clinic. The third design aim I'll highlight is the assurance of confidentiality. And this is another example from the work in Zambia. It is a joint provider-client promise that's made at the outset of a counseling session, through which the provider assures the client of confidentiality, privacy, and good treatment, and also asks the client to commit to sharing openly and asking any questions that they have during the session. And the aim of this is really to create some open space and encourage clients, including male clients, to share their concerns, ask their questions, and feel comfortable and confident that the provider will keep what they say private. This is something that is intended to be used both with male and female clients. We know that men and women both care about confidentiality, even though the specifics of their concerns may be a little bit different. So this is not a design that is only for men, but it is addressing a unique challenge that men expressed regarding their service access. This is just a photo of an early prototype of this design that we tested in Zambia. Final example relates to reminders for providers to encourage them to offer services to all relevant clients. And this is another example from the Uganda work. There were a series of text messages sent to health providers that aim to counter misconceptions that men don't want to hear about family planning or are uninterested in learning more, and to encourage providers to proactively offer that information and counseling to all relevant clients. I'll wrap up just by saying a few words about how these pieces might come together. So I think these examples show some nice concrete illustrations of how an enabling environment in clinics can support men and boys to learn about FP, to learn about how it supports their own goals and their goals for their families, to envision a positive role for themselves in FP choices, in SRH service access for themselves, their partners, and other family members, and to communicate openly with their partners and support their partners in accessing services as well. I will highlight, as Rebecca said so well earlier, that it is really crucial to consider how needs and how the specific challenges may differ across the lifespan. And I think the example from Zambia of the different wellness days is a nice illustration of that, of two designs that are quite similar, but have some important distinctions and separate out those different spaces for adolescent boys and adult men to address their unique challenges and unique priorities in service access. And I'll end with one quick final point, which I know we all know, and that is that while an enabling environment is really critically important, it's certainly not sufficient alone. And I think the Uganda work is a really nice example of that as well, because it brought together both these enabling environment designs and a very intensive community-based intervention that focused on encouraging men to learn about family planning, to consider the choices that they're making and the implications of those choices, to set them up to be ready and willing to come into a clinic. And then the other pieces of the solution set were really focused on encouraging or ensuring that positive environment and welcoming experience when they walked in the door. So I will end with that and very much look forward to the discussion.
All right. Thank you so much, Emily. We are very fortunate to have a very intimate opportunity right now to speak with these three experts. I'm going to invite them up to the front, and hopefully y'all have a few questions and or even clarification, points of clarification, or you have an opportunity to speak with people, especially Rebecca, who's been working in this space for a long time and has run some of the bigger programs related to male engagement that have happened globally. So if they'll come up to the front and we'll try to round up a few questions. I have some others that we can kind of start that conversation. And then I see there's one person in the back who has her hand up, and I knew she would have a question, but yes, I'm gonna sit over here.
Thank you so much. I love how this panel on my favorite topic has been so coherent, and all of the presentations have tied together so beautifully. My name is Margaret Green. I'm with Greenworks Consultancy and contributed to the No Care Do framework. I wanted to ask, and this doesn't have to be responded to right now, but I think that this panel is an important moment to talk about this. Obviously, all of us present are convinced that it's important to work with this, with men and boys, with this group. And I wondered if there are any insights that come out of the framing and the strengthening of programming, whether there are any insights for us as we do advocacy within the family planning space more broadly for getting men and boys to be treated as more central to the entire project of family planning. I think, at this ICFP, there's been some progress. I see some good sessions on men and boys, but I still feel that they're very secondary, and there's not a total integration of the commitment to this work in the in the broader effort or among everybody who participates in it. And I wondered if there are any insights that come from these frameworks that could be used to advocate for this work more broadly. Thank you.
Yeah, so anyone on the panel would like to start this conversation, that would be great.
So that's
It's on.
a difficult question, obviously. I think we've all been spending a lot of time thinking about that. To me, I think that helping our colleagues who are working in family planning really on their theory of change. Like, if this is what we're trying to achieve, how can you leave men out of it? So applying the kind of work that Annette and I shared about a theory of change, and then along the way, thinking about indicators that address that theory of change. Because obviously our indicators right now do only peripherally involve men, right? So I think until we have a more common consensus around how men fit into our theory of change and our program pathways and how we're measuring that along the way, I think we're always just sort of chipping away at it.
I don't know if I have anything else to add, Rebecca, because I'm actually in agreement with what you said. It's absolutely critical, and which is one of the reasons why we're hoping that folks can take this theory of change and then use it to create their own project-specific theories of change. The fact of the matter is, in family planning, we do talk about men a lot, but we talk about them in an adversarial way. And so I think the advocacy piece is really taking that and flipping the script and saying, we're talking about men, but we're not talking about them in a way that's going to help us to actually achieve the outcomes that we're setting out to do. It's a difficult task. I'm still very new in this field compared with folks like Margaret and Rebecca. And I think it's really going to take working with folks at younger and younger ages to really make this case, as Rebecca said earlier, as we're working with younger folks around gender synchronization, to promote gender equality. That's going to have that mindset shift that's going to help to show the impact and the benefits of this work over time, as opposed to when we're working with older adults. It's really a lot harder to implement programming that's going to have the same impact and an impact that's sustainable over time. So I think we really need to just make the case for, we're talking about men, but we're not talking about in a way that's going to help us to do this work well. And also working with younger folks rather than just focusing on adults where we're going to have limited successes.
Could not say anything that wouldn't just be adding and repeating what the two of you said so well. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, please step up to the microphone, or we can pass a microphone around if that's easier.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to ask
Please say your name and where you're from.
Oh, thank you.
Yes,
My name is Jimmy Yuga. I'm from South Sudan, working with USAID. And I'm so much interested on the applicability, and I would like to pick the example of Uganda and Zambia. When we talk about the male involvement, it's really something that very important in terms of SRH and family planning services. But there have been a lot of shifts, like previously, I don't know if they were scientifically designed, that health workers do encourage a couple coming for services, and when they come with a woman coming with with a husband, she's given a chance to, get the services earlier than the rest. The example here we're saying is that if the male are afraid of being taking long in the facilities, they're given a chance. Will that not really affect, again, when we talk about gender-based violence, and again, the women are there taking longer than the men. So that kind of discussion, I don't know if you are sensitive around that area. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and certainly something to be very attuned to. I think it's really important to emphasize to all actors that while it's important to welcome men at clinics and ensure that they're given access to information and counseling and treated well, but that should not ever come at the expense of other clients and female clients, and very importantly, that women should have the right and freedom to access services alone and without their partners. So I think that's something very important to emphasize with health workers in clinics, and to also make sure that while it's important to create space for men, it's equally and probably more important to ensure that there remains space for women and girls in health facilities as well. And it's just about finding ways to strike that balance and making sure that message comes through loud and clear to health workers. I don't know.
I'm really glad you brought that up because I was thinking about that point. I was in a meeting last week, and I was seeing a lot of pushback on male engagement because they were looking at examples when male engagement was done maybe in a not a very positive way, and the example, in fact, that they cited was this idea of letting women who come with their partners go to the front of the line so that other women have to wait, and then some research showing that a lot of those women, they weren't even real partners, they were just bringing them in so they could get to the front of the line. So I'm a little worried that I'm starting to see this. I mean, it's good that there's male engagement going on that can be pushed back against, but I'm starting to see a little bit of a backlash where people are assuming that engaging men is not respecting some of the principles that you mentioned. So I think we need to be reflective about that and remember, that not let male engagement get that sort of, that reputation. And along those lines, I want to talk a little bit. I'm working on a new USAID-funded project called Agency for All, and we're really trying to understand and unpack what agency means for men and for women. And one of the key questions, we had a consultation this morning, people keep asking, what about the conflict between men's agency and women's agency? And I think we really need to do some serious thinking and unpacking of that. How can you expand that? How can you talk about agency from a point of view, and also the community? And so I think we need a lot more nuanced thinking about these hard questions because there are situations where the agency conflicts. So I think we're trying to dance around that and not really understand it and address it.
Great. I think we have another question, please. Say your name, please, and where you're from.
My name is Rosemary Kombo. I'm from Kenya, and thank you so much to the panelists. Male engagement is a very political topic, particularly in Africa and in Kenya. And if there's something we can borrow from the young people is nothing for us without us. I honestly thought that we would have a man on the panel to speak from the horse's mouth, because we women always assume we know what the men want, but what do they want? We've seen cases of gender-based violence as a result of family planning in families. A woman, like you rightly said, in Uganda, would have an invitation or condoms to take to the husband at home, and the man would be like, oh, so you're promiscuous. Now you want me to use a condom. Or on the reverse, the man who has been empowered, so to speak, comes home with a condom, genuinely for family planning. And the wife, on the other hand, says, oh, so you've been sleeping around, so now you want us to use a condom. So these are thorny issues that, for me, I would say men should actually tell us what do they really want. Because even in terms of discussing family planning or reproductive health for that matter within the family is not a very easy topic even for couples. Very few couples would have a husband or a man who would be open to discuss these issues with them. And that is why you find a woman would secretively go to a clinic and get her family planning method without her husband even knowing. And by the time the husband is knowing, this becomes another thorny area in that family. So if more men, with all due respect, can come out and say, what do they want? Is it a misconception? What kind of engagement are we talking about? Because women have done a lot to involve them. And even as you rightfully said, from a program perspective, a lot of interventions have been done to include the men, but they still do not get involved. And until we involve men, particularly in Africa, we still will lag behind when it comes to family planning, because it is a gender norm issue, and we must have mentors, champions from the mature men, because it's all about socialization. If a boy grows up seeing the father in the home, taking family planning topics positively, they will grow up knowing that this is a normal thing to do. But when they don't see their fathers or their senior men involved or even talking about it, they will always believe that this is a woman thing. Why should I also get involved? So I think we need also to get more men involved, more men championing, more men speaking about it, more men openly coming out to talk about family planning rather than the woman, because family planning is known to be synonymous to a woman. But when we have more men also talking about it, then it's a normal thing for both of us, because it takes two to tangle. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. May our panelists want to respond?
I think thank you for your intervention. I just want to say I think what you said just really helps to underscore the importance of applying gender transformative approaches to this work and to doing this work in a gender synchronized way, so that you're really shifting, right, those gender and social norms that are resulting in situations like the one you mentioned, especially when it comes to that intersection of family planning and gender-based violence. So I don't think there's anything else I can add to what you said, because you said it so well. And I think it's just a matter of really being intentional and applying those gender transformative approaches to our programming and involving everyone, like you said.
I'll just add one quote that I always think of. It was a man who I was interviewing in Uganda, and he said to me, "This is not family planning, this is female planning." So, really, he said it very succinctly.
Again, absolutely agree with everything you said, and it is really critically important to ask men what they want and what they value. I would add, in addition, that it's also very important to ask women what role they would like their partners to play, and what programming could do to support their partners in being more supportive as well.
And I'll follow up with that with a little bit, a project that I ran in Malawi a while back called the Malawi Male Motivators created some activities that have been kind of carried through a number of different interventions for men. And one of those activities was called Future Island. And that activity, it asked the man and his partner at that time to think about it was usually men who are in their 20s married to women in their teens. So this was intergenerational marriage. And these men, very often, the first time they were the head of the household. And so in the activity, they asked the men and the woman to think about where they wanted their family to be in 5 years and in 10 years and in 15 years. Oftentimes for the men who participated in that activity, that was the first time they actually ever really had to answer and verbalize how many children they wanted. If they wanted to have children, where they saw their life, and actually thought about those big life changes that happen. And this goes back to the gender norms as mentioned earlier by Danette and others in this panel, and it also speaks to the communication components that were in Emily's interventions. In that oftentimes men don't, I believe this, I don't think that everyone believes this as much as I do, but oftentimes men don't have the actual language and the lexicon to verbalize this, and they haven't done it in practice. Men are not socialized to think about caregiving. This is a whole other space around masculinity and gender that we should be talking about at the same time. And so as we think about this, again, it goes back to children and adolescents at this point in time for the future. Working with the adult men is going to be a little bit more difficult in normalizing that conversation, right? So I think there's kind of a two-pronged approach to this, with one is going to be really focusing on adolescence and gender normative activities and the communication components, but then a whole different set of activities for adult men, because that conversation is going to be, it's much more entrenched. They don't talk about, I will tell you quite frankly, I've never had a conversation with any man friend of mine about the number of kids I wanted to have or anything like that. So and we laugh and I make a joke of it, but it's true. And so that's a very real impact if you think about the role that I would then have in family planning. So yes, we have some other questions, please. Yeah, and why don't we start in the back and then you can ask the next one. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you all for your presentations. My name is Dina Badri. I'm from Sudan, and I'm a doctoral student doing my research on men and family planning. I actually have two questions and one request. I'll start with the request first. Where can we find the actual program of implementation or tools that have been used? I believe you gave us the website that we can go to, but I was thinking of the other presenters if they can share with that. Okay, great, lovely. Now, I'm speaking from two perspectives. My research is looking at men in family planning in the Sudanese context. There's very little to almost nothing done there. I've worked a lot with reproductive health and family planning with women, and men are always seem to be like a sort of appendage to family planning. And the awareness level over there is very low, etc. So my question to you is, in settings which have a very socio-religious context, which kind of governs the behavior of the individual, the marital dynamics and gender norms and so on, has any of your work worked in those kind of contexts where there's a lot of resistance in terms of the background of that society, in addition to socio-religious factors, which plays a critical role in the behavior of people, Muslims, Christians, all kinds of religions, I believe, and also in contexts which are pro-fertility and really actually anti-family planning. So has any of your work
I think that Rebecca has done a significant amount of work with religious groups, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I think the best example is work done by Tear Fund. So Tear Fund is a global organization that works with, it's a faith-based organization, and they have an intervention called Transforming Masculinities that works with faith leaders, faith communities to do scriptural reflection. And it's not just, I mean, I know a lot of people work with faith leaders on family planning, but this is around gender. So working with communities, members, faith leaders to have scriptural reflection around gender norms and that how that leads to using that to prevent violence against women and uptake of family planning. And the two most recent, it's been implemented in many countries around the world, but there's a very robust research and implementation experience in DRC, in Kinshasa, and then also in rural Nigeria, where we worked with Muslim and Christian communities. So again, on the Passages website, there is Transforming Masculinities has a sort of a link, a page, with all the implementation guides, the research, and also how to contact. They're based in the UK, and they do really great work on that.
Can I just add a quick question to that, or continuation? What about masculine behaviors, which have have you also worked in like programs or countries and addressed the issue of masculine behaviors and how it sort of impedes the health behavior? Because when I'm doing my research and my study, I looked at the behavior of men or masculine behavior and how it is a factor which becomes an impediment to him actually accessing a health center. So if you want a man to come to a family planning center, either for the service or for the counseling or whatever, then you actually have to look at the behavior. My study is a qualitative study, so I'm really looking into so many factors. So I was trying to figure out if there is a program or a facility or a service specifically focusing on men. And one of your presentation was talking about having a specific, an explicit invitation for men in order to encourage them, I believe, to come to the health center, to the family planning center. But if these men actually don't come and don't have the psyche of a health behavior sort of, where they go for medical checkups, and so how are you going to convince these same men to come to the family planning center? Add to that, their awareness of family planning is very low. So you're sort of taking the man or the male and looking at all of these aspects, his mental, his all of these things, his socio-cultural background, and then developing something that could be relevant to that kind of male.
So I think that there are a number of programs that doing that. Dominic might know more about them. I just one plug for working with early adolescents. So there's a program also in Kinshasa called Growing Up Great, working with 10 to 14-year-old boys around gender and kind of laying a foundation for addressing some of those issues that you're talking about at an early age.
And we're connected, and we can exchange a little bit more on that, and I can share some of those materials with you. But there are elements to kind of, a lot of it has to do a little bit more context of what the desired outcomes are and things like that. But there are materials that have been developed that can kind of guide that process a little bit more and put some framing around it, as well as these things. And I think as you start to dig into some of the life course theory and the theory of change that it was developed, that may help to guide that process a little bit more as well. I think we're at time, and I don't mean to cut off anyone. I'm sure our panelists will be happy to answer your questions interpersonally, but I think we've hit our time limit for this session. Thank you so much for coming today, and thank our panelists for presenting. And we're very fortunate to have a panel of experts like this today at this session. So thank you.